I speak to you in the name of the living God, blessed Trinity, and lover of your souls. Amen. Once upon a time, there was a father. He, with his wife, had 3 daughters and 7 sons. The man owned lots of land and lots of animals and filled his estate with many things. He was a well-respected man who lavished his family. His kids all had homes on his property, and they were each generous in their own way, hosting parties and events for others. Their father went to church every week and even practiced daily devotions at home, praying not for himself, but for others. Everyone who knew this man called him good. And one day, while this good man was hosting a party, a tornado struck his entire estate and killed his children and all the livestock. The family's belongings were exposed, and looters came and stole whatever they could find, setting fire to what was left. I'd like you to meet Job. He's the man in sackcloth, rubbing dirt on his face and wandering about the scattered rubble of his life. Frail hands grasp bits of paper and thinning photographs. Everything was stolen from him. But grief has stolen the most. It took from him even his health and his future. Job cannot see beyond the point of his devastation. He can only look back. Why was I ever born? He cries to his friends. I loathe my life, and I don't have the strength to endure whatever comes after this. Perhaps you can empathize with Job, maybe from a similar vantage point on the map of your life. A time you seemed to lose everything, too. A time you had to decide whether or how to rebuild. Perhaps your friends, like his, tried to counsel you. That's always wonderful. They tried to help him figure out why bad things happen to good people. Maybe you sinned, they said. You offended God, and you're probably being punished. Thank you. Well, it doesn't surprise you, I'm sure, that this answer does not satisfy the question that continues to burn in Job's mind. Why? Why did this happen? Job's wife offers no help either. She's lost in her own grief. She tells her husband to curse God and die. He doesn't take that advice either. He doesn't die. He doesn't even curse God. And we find Job today in our reading still crying out day in, day out to God for 37 chapters. 37 chapters of Job. His tears fall at the feet of a silent God. When we are in pain, the irony of silence is that it's deafening, right? It can be to us a sign of the withdrawal of love. It can be a sign of disapproval or of punishment. And this is exactly what Job's wife and friends thought was happening to Job. God was disappointed with Job. But Scripture tells us it was just the opposite. In Job chapter 1, we hear directly from God, who describes Job as blameless and upright in God's eyes. Dr. Renita Weems, biblical scholar and author of the book Listening for God, tells us that silence from God is not withdrawal, it's not disapproval or punishment. Silence is the definition of spirituality. The spiritual journey, she writes, is learning how to live in between the last time you heard from God and the next time you hear from God. Our spirituality is discovered in the silence in between. And that's what seems to happen for Job. God is silent for 37 chapters of his life. And his story invites us to consider what we will do with the time in between. The time in between the seasons of our lives, perhaps even in between hearing from God. This is the time that determines what our spirituality is really made of. Job is a companion for any of us who bear a burden, especially those who bear the burden of grief. His story is from an ancient genre known as wisdom literature, because the devastating moments in our lives are exactly the times that we are ripest to learn something about who we are and who God is. Wisdom. As I read stories this week commemorating Juneteenth celebrations, I saw Job's story written all over the lives of Black Americans. Wisdom literature does this too. It reflects universal human concerns through the expression of an individual experience. Job's story and the stories of African Americans, among many other things, reveal to us what life looks like when it's unfair. The story of Job is a story of an innocent man who suffered loss and endured pain through no fault of his own. Stories like Job's don't just show up in American history, they show up in ancient Egypt, in ancient Mesopotamia. His story is an ancient one and a modern one. It reveals how one person's particular struggle maps onto this trope of ours and God's cosmological battle with chaos and evil. But Job's story is unique. It's set apart among other stories in this wisdom genre because it asks us to consider this question: whether human beings will believe in God if God doesn't reward us with material things for our belief. If God doesn't reward us, what happens when life is unfair? Alongside Job, we ask, is believing in God really worth it? Worth our time and our energy? Worth the expenditure of hope? Is it worth the foolish belief in goodness? For 80% of the book of Job, we get to hear what Job thinks about that, what his wife thinks about that, what the neighbors think, what his friends think, even what the devil thinks. The only one we don't hear from is God. Silence is the fence around wisdom. This ancient wisdom saying shows up in cultures all over the world, including Jewish tradition. And it seems to be the concept God leans on in Job's story. Silence is the fence around wisdom. I can almost see God in a Hawaiian t-shirt in the backyard, arms folded, resting on the backyard fence, waiting for all the neighbors to be done with their gossip so that God can finally say God's peace. In Silence, Thomas Merton writes, God ceases to be an object and becomes an experience. Job will soon learn that God is not a force to be reckoned with alone, but a person whom we meet when we suffer. Which brings us to today's reading. After 37 chapters of silence, we get to chapter 38. And I don't know why the lectionary removes the first word of the chapter. I think it's a great word. Today's text begins with the word then. Then God answered. Have you ever stopped to appreciate the word then? I mean it. It's a single word that provides a bridge from one concept to another concept. Then suggests movement and change in time or circumstance. If you find yourself in the valley of despair, the word then is your hope. It's your rope ladder slung over the side of the cliff for you to climb out. Then God said, let there be. Those were some of the first words in the Bible, and after that, something brand new was created. And brand new, that's exactly what Job needed. It may be what you need today, too. It's a reminder that if you're even in your 37th chapter of silence right now, there will be a chapter 38. If you need a then today, then I invite you to consider what it means when God finally answers. If God answers, then Job can no longer accuse God of aloofness. Then Job can no longer accuse God of indifference. Then Job can no longer accuse God of apathy. He can no longer assume God is withdrawn or disapproving or punishing him. Then God answered. God intervened directly into Job's circumstance, the one who created every good thing, the one who laid the foundations of the earth, the one, Job tells us, tilts the waterskins of heavens to make rain fall, the one who put wisdom in the inward parts of your own soul, the one who made the ears that long to hear an answer to the burning question, why? This God speaks to Job with a very godlike response. God answers Job's question with a question. I don't know why it's so hard to get a direct answer from God these days. But I do know that Jesus answered questions with questions this very same way. The teachers of the law would come to him, and he would answer their questions with questions and stories. The prophet Isaiah tells us that God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and God's ways are not our ways, which is probably true and could be a good answer. But I also wonder if God responds to our questions with questions, because God knows that when we are suffering, the last thing we need is for others to come fix us. What we need is someone to come and to thrust our questions back onto us so that we can answer them for ourselves. Why? It's not just the question we ask in despair, though we do. It's the question a child asks about everything. The human spirit from its infancy will not accept someone else's answers, even when they are readily supplied. Why? In order to feel satisfied with an answer, a person must come to the answer themselves. When chaos and suffering come our way, we expect God to come and untie the knot in our hearts and in our heads, but God never will. Instead, God comes to us and asks the questions alongside us. If Job's question is why, God's question is who? Whoever it was who made the garments for clouds and swaddled darkness when it was just a little baby, this is the one who's here now with you in your suffering today. All along, it was not words that Job needed, it was God's presence. God's presence with Job while he asked the hardest questions of his life, the questions that would determine his spirituality. And when we are asking the hardest questions of our lives, we do not need family and friends to answer our questions. We need someone to be with us in them until we discover our own answers to our own questions. This is what God does. God befriends Job in ways his human friends did not. In the final chapters of Job, God actually speaks directly to Job's friends and tells them, "You did a poor job." Instead of counseling your friend, go back to Job and ask him to pray for you. Because Job's suffering taught him something. Job gained wisdom. He found his spirituality in the suffering and confirmed before everyone that he truly was blameless and upright in the eyes of God. The author I referenced earlier, Dr. Weems, she concludes her book, Listening for God, by sharing from her lived experience as a Black woman. She writes, "Our deepest, most painful wounds not only leave us with scars that we bear forever, but also, if we make our peace with them, leave us wiser, stronger, more sensitive than we otherwise would have been had we not been afflicted with them. In the end, God does not withhold blessing from the one who does right. As the adversary had hoped in this story, the adversary hoped that Job would curse God and die, but Job did not. And so God restored the fortunes of Job, giving him twice as much as he had before. This morning, we remember Juneteenth, Freedom Day, the day Union troops traveled to Galveston, Texas to announce General Order Number 3. According to executive decree, all slaves are free. This happened in 1865. Juneteenth is only in its 4th year as a national holiday, but there are Black churches who have been celebrating this day since 1866. And I wonder if it's no coincidence that the story of Job cycles through our lectionary this time of year, because it's a story that has resonated in Black churches for centuries. It's a story that reminds those who have lost everything because of systemic racism that they have endured. Juneteenth isn't really about commemorating a proclamation. It's about celebrating a people's enduring spirit. Even today, more Black Americans believe in God than any other racialized group in the U.S. Spirituality is made in the in-between, in the moments in between God speaking. While everyone talks about how you must have done something wrong to deserve your suffering, God longs to shape your spirituality in the silence. Job's story and the story of Black Americans remind us that spiritual wisdom is forged in struggle. May we learn from these stories today and listen for God within them, so that in our own time we can be a part of that twofold blessing that is to come, the one that God will give on the other side of injustice.